All right, so you sent in some really interesting stuff about Jane Eyre,
Yeah.
Dr. Rathworth's discussion, and a really thorough analysis. I mean,
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
yeah, and we want to, we're not going to just like rehash the whole plot.
Yeah.
We want to really get into what makes this book,
Right.
so powerful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you've given us a fantastic jumping off point with these sources, and we can really explore, the lasting impact of Jane Eyre and how it fits into, the bigger picture of literature. And
Absolutely.
we'll be looking at Jane's journey as a character, but also the context of Victorian England and how that shaped her story.
Right. And I think even if you've read Jane Eyre, more than once, the way these sources kind of come at it, there's some fresh perspectives in there.
Oh,
So
definitely.
we're going to trace her journey, that difficult childhood she has, and then, that really complex relationship with Mr. Rochester, and
Definitely.
see how the book tackles some themes that are surprisingly, relevant even today.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with like the origins of the novel.
Okay, so Jane Eyre was published in 1847. And right away, something that both of your sources point out is that Charlotte Brontë chose to publish it under this male pseudonym, Currer.
Hmm.
And that was not, just a random choice. It really says a lot about the literary world back then and the obstacles that women authors faced, if they wanted to be taken seriously.
That's a really good point. And thinking about Charlotte Bronte's life, she was born in 1816, and her life kind of feels connected to the emotional depth of her writing.
Yeah.
She came from this really talented literary family,
Right.
but she also experienced a lot of loss early on. Her mother died, and then later on her sisters died as well. So it's hard not to think about, how these experiences might have shaped the emotional currents that you see in Jane Eyre. Absolutely. And the comprehensive analysis that you sent in really emphasizes how important the novel was when it came out. They call it a cornerstone of English literature. And I think that's accurate.
Mm.
Jane Eyre was really innovative in the way it portrayed a woman's inner life in such a realistic and intimate way.
Right.
The reader really gets to experience Jane's thoughts and feelings in a way that was pretty new and had a huge impact.
Right. It wasn't just about what was happening, externally. It was about her inner world and her psychological journey.
Absolutely.
And as that analysis points out, it was really pioneering in its emotional storytelling, really delving into themes of resilience, the fight against social injustice, and Jane's, constant search for her own identity.
Yeah, and that leads us perfectly to the structure of the novel itself.
Mm.
Jane's life unfolds in these distinct phases, and both of your sources outline these stages. I think understanding this progression is really key to understanding her development as a character.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning, Gateshead Hall.
Okay.
Those opening chapters. We meet 10-year-old Jane, an orphan in this really hostile environment with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and those, less than charming cousins.
Yeah, less than charming is putting lightly. The animosity that Jane faces from Mrs. Reed is just, palpable. It's so clear that she's unwelcome there. She's a constant reminder of,
Yeah.
Her late husband's affection for Jane's mother.
Yeah.
And then that incident in the Red Room, where she's locked away after she dares to stand up to John Reed's bullying.
Yeah.
That's a truly traumatic experience. And your analysis is right to point out that this is a pivotal moment for Jane. It's a catalyst for the rest of her journey.
Absolutely. I mean, that experience of intense fear and injustice really seems to plant the seeds of, defiance and this longing for escape.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what leads Mrs. Reed to send her away to Lowood School.
Right. And so Lowood is that second phase, those middle chapters. And in a lot of ways, as your sources point out, Lowood represents a different kind of confinement for Jane. Under the guise of charity, Mr. Brocklehurst, imposes these incredibly harsh and often hypocritical conditions.
Right.
The analysis you shared really highlights his inconsistencies, preaching austerity while living, quite comfortably himself.
Mm.
It's a sharp critique of institutions in the Victorian era, don't you think?
It really is. And yet, in the middle of all that bleakness, Jane forms this really important bond with Helen Burns.
Right.
And Helen's character, with her, emphasis on forgiveness and enduring hardship, she clearly has a huge impact on Jane's early development.
Yes, but your comprehensive analysis makes a really astute point.
Yeah.
While Helen's philosophy of passive acceptance gives Jane a model to follow Helen's eventual death during that typhus epidemic, kind of pushes Jane towards a different understanding of how to be in the world.
Right.
She learns resilience from Helen, but ultimately she takes a more active approach to her own life. And it's also worth noting, like both sources do that after some, scandal conditions at Lowood do get better.
Yeah.
And Jane spends quite a bit of time there, both as a student and then as a teacher.
Right.
This period of relative stability is really important for her development before she goes out on her own as a governess.
Which leads perfectly into the third phase, Thornfield Hall, which
Yeah.
is really key chapters. Oh, Thornfield. When I was reading through the material you sent, this is the section that really stood out. This is where the atmosphere gets so thick, with that mysterious laughter, the enigmatic Mr. Rochester, and that undeniable connection that sparks between him and Jane.
Oh, absolutely. Mr. Rochester is such a compelling and unconventional character.
Right.
I mean, he's wealthy and powerful, of course,
Yeah.
but he's also deeply scarred and carrying a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, and something both your sources highlight, is that his relationship with Jane develops on this intellectual and spiritual level first. He values her mind, her independent spirit, which was, quite progressive for the time.
Right.
But of course, those unsettling things that happen,
Yeah.
the strange laughter, the fire, they're constant reminders that there are secrets hidden within Thornfield.
Yeah, and then that dramatic unraveling. I mean,
Yeah.
the wedding ceremony is so abruptly interrupted. And then the truth about Bertha Mason, Rochester's first wife who's locked away in the attic, it's such a huge twist.
It is.
And Jane's reaction, as both your sources emphasize, is really important. She chooses to leave, putting her own moral integrity above her love for Rochester, which is, clearly very deep.
Yeah, that's a huge turning point, isn't it? It really shows that central tension between her desire for love and her commitment to her own autonomy.
Yeah.
Jane's decision to leave, even though it's so painful for her, really highlights her independence. And this leads us to the fourth phase, Morehouse. Those chapters where Jane is truly on her own.
Yeah, this is a period of real hardship for Jane, as your sources detail.
Right.
She's penniless. She has no connections. She wanders around before she finds this unexpected refuge with the Rivers family, St. John, Diana, and Mary. And then that almost unbelievable discovery that they're her cousins, and then she gets this inheritance.
Wow.
Talk about a change in circumstances.
Yeah, huge shift in her life there.
Really?
And it's during this time that we see another possible romantic path open up for Jane.
Right?
This time with St. John Rivers.
Yeah.
But as both your sources point out, the contrast between Rochester's passionate nature and St. John's cold, duty-driven proposal.
Yeah.
He wants to marry her for missionary work, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a marriage of convenience. There's no real love there. And it couldn't be more different from Rochester.
Right.
And Jane's ultimate refusal, prompted by that almost supernatural experience of hearing Rochester's voice,
Wow.
really shows how deep and unique her connection to him is.
And that brings us to the final phase for Undine Manor, those concluding chapters. Jane returns and she finds Thornfield in ruins destroyed by fire.
Right.
And Rochester alive, but, really bearing the scars both physically and emotionally. He's blind and he's maimed.
And in this state of shared vulnerability, their relationship truly becomes one of equals.
Yeah.
As both sources point out. Jane doesn't return out of obligation or because she has to. She comes back purely out of love.
Right.
A deep desire to be with him and their eventual marriage at Ferndean. And the fact that Rochester regains partial sight, a detail both your sources emphasize,
Right.
really symbolize this renewed hope and a hard-won happiness that Jane achieves entirely on her own terms.
It's such a powerful and satisfying resolution.
It is.
Now let's, dig a little deeper into some of these key characters who populate Jane's world.
Okay.
We've talked about Jane and Rochester quite a bit, but thinking about Jane Eyre as the protagonist, what really stands out to you from these sources?
I think what's so striking is her incredible intelligence and her unwavering resilience. She faces so much adversity, but she never loses her inner strength or her sense of self-worth. The sources also emphasize her honesty and the fact that she's described as plain-looking. And in a way, this allows her inner qualities like her intellect and her spirit to really shine through.
Right.
Her journey is all about searching for love and belonging, but she absolutely refuses to compromise her independence to get those things.
Right.
She's constantly challenging those expectations that were placed on women in Victorian society.
And Rochester, he's such a fascinatingly flawed character.
He is.
Not your typical romantic hero.
Not at all. Both your sources detail that he is wealthy and capable of great passion, but he's also deeply wounded by his past and prone to impulsive behavior.
Yeah.
What's compelling is that he comes to value Jane, not for her beauty or her social status, but for her sharp mind and her independent spirit. Their relationship transforms into this genuine partnership that's built on mutual respect and intellectual connection, which, like we said, was pretty radical for that era.
Then there's Bertha Mason, also kind of, pushed into that role of the madwoman in the attic. But what do your sources say about her significance beyond just being a plot device?
Well, both sources emphasize that while Bertha definitely embodies those Gothic elements of the novel, the mystery, the sense of danger, she also represents the hidden consequences of Rochester's past and the constraints of Victorian society.
Right.
Your analysis in particular highlights how she can be seen as symbolizing, anxieties about female sexuality, about race, about mental illness,
Right.
all these issues that were often hidden away
Yeah.
or repressed.
Yeah.
Her confinement and her tragic end really raised some uncomfortable questions about Victorian attitudes towards those who were seen as outside the norm.
And what about St. John Rivers? He almost seems to be like the opposite of Rochester.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
He represents a completely different path for Jane.
Right.
Where Rochester is all about intense emotion.
Yeah.
St. John is ruled by duty and self-denial.
Yeah.
His proposal to Jane is entirely practical. There's no real warmth or emotional connection there.
Right.
He really highlights that theme of personal fulfillment versus societal expectation and religious duty.
Right.
And Jane's rejection of him really shows that fundamental need she has for genuine love and intellectual companionship in a relationship.
We also can't forget about, the roles that Mrs. Reed and Helen Burns play in Jane's early life. I mean, they're so formative.
Yes, as your analysis details, Mrs. Reed's cruelty and neglect early on really established that lack of familial love in Jane's childhood, and it fuels her lifelong desire for belonging and acceptance.
Right.
Helen, on the other hand, embodies this philosophy of religious piety and passive acceptance of suffering.
Right.
And while she definitely influences Jane in terms of understanding forgiveness and enduring hardship, Jane ultimately takes a more assertive and self-directed approach to life.
Yeah.
She moves away from Helen's passivity.
And Mr. Brocklehurst, it's such a, vivid portrayal of religious hypocrisy.
Oh. Absolutely. Both your sources point out that he embodies this critique of the potential for corruption and mistreatment within Victorian institutions.
Yeah.
He uses religious language to mask his own selfishness and cruelty towards the vulnerable children he's supposed to be caring for.
You're right.
He's definitely a target of Bronte's social commentary.
So let's look at some of the overarching themes that really emerge from Jane Eyre.
Okay.
As highlighted in the material you sent, that tension between love and the need for individual autonomy seems absolutely central.
It is. Jane's whole journey can be seen as this quest to reconcile her desire for love and connection with her equally strong need to maintain her independence and self-respect. Her refusal of Rochester initially, even though she has such strong feelings for him, is a powerful example of this.
Right.
Her commitment to her own morals and her autonomy. And it's only after she becomes financially independent that she feels like she can go back to him as an equal partner.
She famously declares, and this is in your analysis, "I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine. We are precisely suited in character. Perfect concord is the result." And I think this quote really sums up that balance that she finally achieves.
And the theme of religion is woven so complexly through the story.
It is.
With all those different religious figures that we talked about.
Yes, from the hypocrisy of Brocklehurst to the almost saintly resignation of Helen and the rigid ambition of St. John. Brontë shows us this really nuanced range of religious belief and practice.
Right.
And Jane ends up forging her own spiritual path, finding a balance between her moral beliefs and accepting, earthly pleasures.
Yeah.
The sources you sent point out how she turns to prayer for comfort and guidance, which shows her faith. But she doesn't just blindly follow any of those extreme or corrupted forms of religion that we see in the novel.
And the book also offers a really insightful critique of social class in Victorian England, particularly through Jane's, kind of ambiguous position as a governess, right? The governess occupied this really precarious place in the Victorian social hierarchy, not quite part of the family, but also not one of the servants.
Yeah.
And Jane's internal struggles and her hesitation to marry Rochester are partly because of this awareness of the social gap between them.
Right.
Her question, do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, I am soulless and heartless? Which is quoted in your analysis, really exposes those social prejudices that she's up against.
Yeah.
And the fact that she marries Rochester after inheriting her own fortune, that's a challenge to those rigid class boundaries. It suggests that real connection is possible beyond social standing.
And the way gender relations are explored in Jane Eyre feels so ahead of its time.
It really does. Jane constantly asserts her rights as an individual.
Right.
And rejects being subservient to men, whether it's Brocklehurst or the initially dominant Rochester, or even the controlling St. John. It's remarkable for that time period. Her famous line, "Women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties as much as their brothers do,"
Yeah.
which your analysis highlights, really shows her feminist perspective.
Right.
And even her marriage to Rochester, who becomes physically dependent on her, can be seen as a symbol of a relationship built on mutual respect and equality rather than traditional power dynamics.
And the theme of home and belonging is so resonant throughout Jane's story.
It is. For Jane, home isn't just a place. It's about feeling connected, having a purpose, being loved and accepted.
Right.
Her feeling alienated and a discord and useless at Gateshead, her connection with Rochester at Thornfield, which is ultimately broken,
Right.
and then her finally creating a true home with him at Ferndean after she becomes independent, all highlight this deep understanding of what home really means for her.
And we can't overlook that sense of anxiety and uncertainty that runs through the whole novel, often conveyed through those really striking Gothic elements.
Absolutely. Their red room, that ominous storm that damages the chestnut tree. Bertha herself. These aren't just atmospheric details, as your sources point out. They're powerful external representations of Jane's internal struggles, her anxieties about her social position, her relationships, and even the broader societal anxieties and repressed emotions of the Victorian era.
Right.
Bertha, in particular, can be seen as embodying the darker irrational side of human nature and those fears that Victorian society tried so hard to suppress.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive,
Right.
let's circle back to some of those key facts and, the broader literary context of Jane Eyre.
Okay.
We've touched on the publication year and Bronte's use of a pseudonym.
Right. Publishing in 1847 under that male name Currer Bell was a strategic choice, as your sources suggest.
Yeah.
To overcome that potential gender bias in the literary world and make sure the novel was taken seriously. It really tells us a lot about the challenges that women writers faced at the time.
Yeah.
And the analysis you provided correctly identifies the novel as both a Bildungsroman,
Right.
Tracing Jane's journey of self-discovery and maturation,
Right.
a Gothic romance
Right.
incorporating mystery,
Yeah.
and those elements of the supernatural in those dramatic, often isolated settings.
Right.
The comparisons to Dickens's David Copperfield, in terms of the Bildungsroman narrative, are spot on.
And setting the story in early 19th century Northern England really grounds it in this specific historical and social landscape.
Absolutely. The backdrop of the Industrial Revolution and the expanding British Empire
Right.
provides a crucial context for understanding the novel's social critiques,
Right.
about class poverty and the limited opportunities for women.
Yeah, and that first-person narration from Jane's perspective looking back on her life
Yes,
is so important to the intimate and reflective tone of the book.
it is.
It gives us this unparalleled access to her inner thoughts, her moral development, her spiritual journey, and that was a really big innovation in novel writing at the time.
Yes, it was.
And that reflective, passionate, and often critical tone really aligns with, Bronte's exploration of those themes of gender inequality and social injustice.
Exactly, and its literary significance is huge.
Yeah.
Your analysis quotes someone calling Brontë the first historian of the private consciousness,
Mhm.
which is a really powerful and accurate description.
Yeah.
Jane Eyre is without a doubt a seminal feminist text, and it continues to resonate with readers today.
Absolutely.
And as we can see from the countless adaptations in literature, film, and other media.
So, for you who sent us this material,
Yeah.
what we've really delved into here is Jane Eyre's incredibly compelling and ultimately, triumphant journey of self-discovery.
Yes.
It's a novel that tackles these timeless and still relevant themes.
Absolutely.
Love independence and the fight for social justice,
Mhm.
all set against, this vivid backdrop of Victorian England.
It's a book that continues to speak to us because it explores those fundamental human desires for connection and autonomy so powerfully.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it offers the sharp critique of societal norms. Those norms that tried to limit individual potential, especially for women.
This deep dive into the sources you provided has been so illuminating.
It has.
Now, as a final point for you to consider,
Okay.
given Jane's, incredibly strong commitment to her independence and then her eventual marriage to Rochester,
Right.
what do you think Charlotte Brontë is ultimately suggesting about the possibility of achieving true equality within a patriarchal society?
That's a great question. Or maybe think about those Gothic elements we discussed, the secrets, the shadows, that feeling of unease. How do those elements contribute to your understanding of Jane's inner struggles and those broader societal anxieties that were so characteristic of the Victorian era?
We really encourage you to revisit Jane Eyre. with these insights in mind. Or if you haven't read it yet, explore this remarkable novel for yourself.
It's a powerful one.
This has been a deep dive, aimed at giving you a shortcut to being well informed. Until our next exploration.
See you then.